Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this WebEx that we're hosting on Thursday afternoon on fatigue risk management in the new normal. Christina and I are delighted to talk to you about this incredibly interesting topic at the moment. So my name is Alex Holmes, and I'm the Research Director at Clockwork Research. And I'm joined today by Christina Roshito, who is a fantastic combination of academic expertise and then also knowledge of the kind of operational realities of aviation. So Christina completed a PhD on the effects of long-haul flying on cabin crew well-being, specifically on the behavioural or the psycho-behavioural predictors of jet lag amongst cabin crew, which is something that she knows a thing or two about because she was a long-haul cabin crew for 20 or so years. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy today, at least if that is only hearing Christina talk on this topic, which I certainly enjoy learning from her every time I have the chance to talk. So we're talking about fatigue risk management in the new normal today. And we're going to start off with some ground rules, which are all the kind of usual things in terms of just if you can keep your microphones off and your cameras off as well. If you are experiencing audio problems, there's a dial-in option. You can use your phone to log in. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end, of course, and we certainly encourage you to ask questions. You can do that in two ways. So you can raise your hand. There's a little feature on your remote control panel there. And there's also a little question option where you can type your question if you prefer to do that. And we can go through as many as possible at the end of the session. And finally, the webinar is recorded and is going to be made available afterwards. So what we're hoping to get through today is to start off by exploring the challenges. I mean, there's no shortage of challenges at the moment of our new normal for fatigue risk management. Then Christina's going to talk about sleep health and how we can apply this model to collecting data on sleep health via a questionnaire that she's going to talk in detail about, with the intent of hopefully trying to help collect some of that data on fatigue risk management that we're missing at the moment. And then we'll look at fatigue risk management, so not just measuring in the new normal, and then we'll finish off with our questions. So the pandemic has initiated changes in the aviation industry that I think none of us could have even imagined a year ago. Airlines are fighting for survival and looking everywhere for efficiencies. To survive, business models have been rewritten seemingly overnight, and sadly, large numbers of crew are no longer in work, and that's either permanent or temporary. And one of the underpinning FRM principles has always been to flatten the workload curve and to distribute the work areas or the fatigue evenly or similarly amongst crew. And of course, our current situation means that at the moment, the opposite's happening. So while there's a lot of crew that aren't flying at all, those crew that are on the line tend to be working quite hard. And they're flying new and quite complicated operations. The new operating environment includes things like exemptions, whether that's kind of extended FTPs, reduced rest, or resting on board perhaps on a turnaround that used to be in a hotel. And then also there's all the demands of the restrictions and the added kind of procedures for managing COVID protections in flight. So, the complexity and the change, unfortunately, are here to stay for the next couple of years, it looks like, as the industry responds to the timeline of the pandemic in different countries and local restrictions come and go. Until, vaccinations are widely available. So while we're grappling with all of this, Fatigue risk management, as part of safety management, is being asked some pretty big questions, like how do we ensure ALARP is being maintained during this unprecedented period of change, and looking forward to the recovery. I think it's safe to say that pandemic has been a bit of a shock for fatigue risk management. With some operators finding that the investment that they'd made, and then all of the work that they'd done to develop, a just culture and effective FRM was kind of worth its weight in gold. And they've been able to kind of turn those capabilities to, managing our current situation. On the other hand, at other airlines, fatigue risk management is really struggling to cope, and especially sometimes with teams that were smaller than they were before the pandemic. So one lesson that I think the pandemic has taught all of us is the close and kind of deep interrelationship between our well-being and how well we're sleeping. So if we look here at these, the scale here that's been constructed to show some of the positives and challenges that the pandemic's presented for kind of pilot wellness. Obviously, there are some advantages, and I think the salary, getting out of the house, having a purpose, some social interaction with colleagues, the benefits of these things can't be underestimated. And certainly for all of us that are lucky enough to still be at work, we're very grateful for that, and fully appreciate that being out of work is undoubtedly awful. So as well as those advantages, some of the others include some benefits for sleep that some of us are experiencing. So there's various different kind of providers of sleep monitoring technology, so Apple Watches or Fitbits or whatever it might be, tend to be showing kind of pretty consistently that most people are getting more sleep now, and that's largely because of the lack of commute. So we're able to kind of sleep in an extra half an hour or an hour in the morning. So that's not true for everyone, but overall it does seem to be a trend. So onto the challenges. Of course, the quantity and quality of kind of challenges is huge. And we are in the middle of a health crisis, of a mental health crisis, and also a sleep crisis. And I think some of the challenges that we're all struggling with, this includes crew and those of us that aren't on the line, are the extra demands of home. So whether that's illness, yourself, or with supporting members of your family or your loved ones. Additional challenges of childcare while schools are closed, or the demands of homeschooling, social isolation, and then the kind of financial uncertainty for some people as we look to the next couple of years. Specifically for crew, we've got that challenging environment that we touched on already. And the unstable schedule. So just the fact that, what you thought you were doing one day seems to just change from one day to the next as the operation reacts to all of the changes going on in the world at the moment. There's some guilt around, being in work and your colleagues not being working, and then also concern about, perhaps the well-being of the colleagues sitting next to you, but also kind of more broadly as well. So this balance between the kind of the positives and the challenges that we're all experiencing is kind of in flux. So you'll know from your own experience that you have good days and bad days, good weeks and bad weeks, and we're constantly changing in terms of how well we're sleeping and how well we're coping as this kind of pandemic rolls out. So as well as the changes over time, there's also big differences between groups or subgroups within a crew population that we do need to understand if we're going to manage fatigue risk and wellness. And some of those are what we'd call pre-existing disadvantages. So, women, people on temporary contracts, people with poor health are suffering disproportionately. and at a kind of operational level, there might be more challenges faced by maybe crew on particular fleets, or maybe at a more granular level, certain types of operation, trips, or FTPs. So it really is that kind of level of detail in terms of understanding how the different groups are coping from one month to the next, that we need to get at if we're going to be able to apply the appropriate mitigators. So what I wanted to do next, hopefully this is going to work, is a little poll that I'll present to you guys. So let me just select this one. I'm going to launch it now. Can you see a poll? Which is about, yeah. So there's a question there, which is, how would you rate the effectiveness of your airline's fatigue risk management? Oh, sorry, lost you for a second there, I think. So with the poll, if you would be open to completing that poll, we will have a look at the results towards the end of the presentation. Obviously, none of this data is being recorded. We're not going to link your results to your name or your airline or anything like that. It's just a kind of a quick poll so that we can get a gauge on how well airlines are collecting this data, so we can kind of explore that at the end. So I'm going to just close that little poll now there, and we can hopefully go back to my slides. Can you see the slides now?
Yep.
Fabulous. Okay. So certainly, fatigue risk management is being asked some big questions now. We're being asked whether, the new operations are safe from a fatigue perspective, and, are we maintaining ALAP? Perhaps the first couple of, exemptions are fine, but how do we know if it's still okay in a month? Now we know that things are going to be like this for the long term. What are the kind of cumulative effects of operating in this new way, in 6 months' time? And certainly based on some of the conversations that we've had with people working in FRM, there does seem to be a bit of a gap in terms of the data that has historically been collected on fatigue and the kind of data that we need now. So some of the challenges I've summarized in this table here. So if we look at something like fatigue reporting, so these reports tend to be pretty small in number. They're largely kind of linked to a fatigue event. So let's say, challenges to do with a noisy hotel. It's not what you'd call system-wide monitoring. We're not, sampling the health of the operation. We've also got, a possible under-reporting problem at the moment when the operation is really fragile, and there could be increased pressure to be seen to get the job done. In terms of a top of descent survey, which could be beneficial at the moment, obviously not necessarily, because we don't get any why behind our ratings. So we're going to not understand what it is that is contributing to those results. Scientific study, annual fatigue surveys, so these are great, kind of really rich sources of data, but they're too slow. While our operation is changing so dramatically, we don't have 6 months to wait to find out what's going on. Biomathematical models, still very much in use, but some questions starting to be asked about the sleep predictions and whether they're really reflecting, sleep in the new normal, whether that's down route or perhaps in flight when we've got different numbers of crew on the flight. And finally, well-being. So, historically, fatigue risk management, we're going to learn a little more from Christina, has not done such a great job of collecting data on well-being. We've relied mostly on crew to self-identify when they need some additional support, and we do need to have better kind of integration between our fatigue risk management and our well-being management system. So I'm going to hand over to Christina now.
Thank you.
She's going to talk to you about a method that we've developed to hopefully fill in some of these gaps. to provide the kind of breadth and depth and speed of information that we need to manage fatigue risk in the new normal. So
Okay.
let me just...
Thank you very much. Can you see the screen? What is sleep health?
I can see it, Christina.
Okay,
Yes.
great. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much also for the lovely presentation, introduction, I mean, about me earlier. And welcome everybody. I hope you're going to enjoy the next part of this webinar. So before I talk to you about sleep health, I'd like to give a short introduction or overview about the sources of stress in normal operations, and that these can be divided into 3 categories. They can be physiological, if you think about sleep, fatigue, and illness, or they can be psychological, if you think about emotional issues or financial issues or problems to do with work-life balance, or they can come from physical and mental demands that are associated with operating an aircraft. And but as Alex has illustrated, in the new normal, we have a number of stressors. And how do these impact sleep health? Well, they do so through worry and rumination, which is difficulty switching off from work and non-work related experience. And when we are in a state of worry and rumination, we activate the fight or flight response, which is associated with an increase in blood pressure and heart rate. And as a result, our body, when we are in this mode, our body is under threat. And the last thing really that you want to do when we are in that mode is sleep, because in order to sleep, we need to relax. So the research has pointed out that worry and rumination affects our ability to fall asleep, our ability to get the sleep that we need, and our ability to sleep well. So there's a strong relationship between worry and rumination and sleep quality. But interestingly, this link between worry and rumination and sleep health is present when sleep is assessed subjectively through self-report, but also through objective methods like actigraphy. And this brings me to the next point, which is that we know full well from the operation that sleep health is a major risk factor for fatigue, and we know now in the last few years that actually poor sleep health is a predictor of poor mental health. So poor sleep is a major risk factor for depression, for example. So all these variables are really important and they need to be assessed, particularly sleep health. And so how does stress relate to sleep health and the pandemic? This was some research that was carried out during lockdown back in May, and they looked at differences in sleep disturbance between people who found coronavirus stressful and those who didn't. And what they found was that those who find coronavirus stressful were more than twice as likely as those who didn't to report disturbed sleep. And now this research was carried out in the UK, as I said, back in May, and it's from a representative sample of adults between 16 and 75. But it's still relevant today because we are going through different phases during this pandemic. It's quite fluid. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are different timelines around the world, and particularly here in the UK and in Europe, we are faced with the prospect of a second wave and more restrictions, and therefore there will be it's likely that more people will be worried about the future, and particularly crew, because the aviation has been impacted heavily by the pandemic. So that brings me to the IUCAT model of sleep health, which has been proposed by BICE and looks at the most important dimensions of sleep health, which are regularity, which is the extent to which sleep is displaced across time, sleep satisfaction, which is a subjective measure of sleep quality, Alertness, we're all familiar with that. And timing, which is the extent to which the main sleep period is in sync with the circadian rhythm. Sleep efficiency, which is the ability to remain asleep whilst in bed. And sleep duration is clearly important, and the National Sleep Foundation has got guidelines about the ideal ranges, which should be between 7 and 9 for adults. And therefore, on the basis of these dimensions are really important because they underpin physical, mental health, and good performance. And this is based on evidence that has been, that is from research that has been carried out in the last 50 years in different contexts and with different populations. So what I really like about this model is the fact that it really focuses our attention to the core dimension of sleep health. In addition, if you do repeat the assessment of these dimensions, you can measure change across time, but also across a run of shifts, for example. And the focus is positive. So the emphasis is on wellness, but not on the lack of a sleep disorder, for example, which is typical of sleep medicine. And because of that, we can actually all improve our sleep health. It's not something that we either have or we don't have. So sleep health is actually along a continuum, and we can see that maybe during this pandemic, we're all going to be maybe towards the left of this continuum, but there is room for improvement. And whilst this is beyond the scope of this webinar, there is a lot that we can do about each dimension. And also what is really good is if you if you improve one dimension, you're likely to then produce an effect on the other. So they're all interrelated, as you can appreciate. But of course, we needed to adapt this model to the operation. So my next my next section is going to look at how we can do that. So what other dimensions are important in the operation? Well, for example, workload, it's something that we should assess in flight. We can't assume that it's easier at the moment to, maybe there is less to do in terms of cabin service, but that's not necessarily the case in all operations and across the world. So this is very much dependent on your particular airline. But we acknowledge that from pre-trip to recovery, at every stage of the schedule can actually impact the sleep opportunity. But that impact is going to be dependent on other variables like sleep need. So we need to assess that, but also sleep variability. So it's an acknowledgement that we don't all cope with sleep disruption and circadian disruption in the same way. So that needs to be taken into account. So it is a post-trip sleep health plus questionnaire. I'll explain the plus later. But for now, I just want you to focus on the fact that we obviously this is something that you assess post-trip, but you ask then crew to refer back, to think back about sleep at different point of the trip. So for example, this could be a long-haul trip. And the questions refer to different points and different dimensions. And ideally, you would want to ask a question for each dimension and for each reference point. However, the problem is that you'll end up with a very long questionnaire. And the focus of this is that you provide something that is quick and easy to complete. And also it very much depends on the aim of your project as to where you want to concentrate, what you want to find out. It very much depends on what questions you have about the operations. So this is kind of a kind of a minimum that we would like to see. For example, for alertness, you can just concentrate on alertness during in flight and not throughout the trip. But that's very much dependent on what the project questions are. So having a look at the plus bit of the questionnaire, of course, as always, you would assess the participants' demographic and schedule data, but we've added some variables because we were interested in sleep variability and how that affects sleep outcome. So we conceive that as more of a kind of a trait that affects sleep outcome. So we introduced 2 questions that assessed how sleep is impacted by stress, and whether people are more morning or evening people, because we know that preference for morning or evening hours has an impact on how you adapt to a difference, in schedules or jet lag. So those were the extra variables that we looked at, as well as sleep need, as I said on the earlier slide. And now to look at how we would measure sleep health itself in terms of regularity. So the questions about sleep timing are necessary to obviously derive this dimension. For sleep satisfaction, you would use one question that is actually in the IUSated model of sleep health. For alertness, you can use KSS. You can assess the timings of your main sleep and naps, which obviously would then be combined to provide the dimension of sleep duration. And for sleep efficiency, you will look at the sources of sleep disturbance. And finally, for workload, these are very much operationally relevant. So they would vary depending on when you are using this model, and they were likely to vary by role as well. And the aim, of course, is to assess change across time and schedules, but again, it's very much dependent on your aims. And you might have questions about using subjective methods. They are open to bias, they're opinions, but we think that we can improve the reliability of provided by subjective methods. And there is a difference. So, for example, in a survey, the links between variables are usually made by the participants. So, for example, the typical question might be, to what extent is your sleep duration affected by early starts? And when participants answer that question, basically those links are already made for you, i.e. the answer would be that your sleep disturbance is linked to early starts or not, as the case may be. But here in this Posttrip questionnaire, it is the researcher that makes those links between the variables. For example, for sleep duration, we will make comparisons across different groups, across different days, and across different schedules. And that way, the bias is reduced. Further, it is important that we reduce recall bias. So, the reference point, so when you're asking crew to think back to the past, you can't obviously ask them to recall what they did 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, or even in the last month. It's very difficult because schedules vary. So to improve recall, obviously depends on the operation, but for long haul, for example, you would limit it to from post-trip to post-trip. And for short haul, for example, you could choose a number of trips between days off. And that way you are going to reduce the impact of bias. And that brings me to the end of the method section. So I'm going to hand over back to Alex. Here we go. I think, here we go. I think I've done that. Has it worked?
Let me know if you can see my screen. It's got the
Sure. I can.
effectivefm. Brilliant.
I can.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks so much for explaining the questionnaire, the Sleep Plus questionnaire, which is the result of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, remotely, of course, at the moment. But in order to kind of to build that tool, just to give you the poll results, which I'll now share with you. I think. So here we go. Can you see the poll results there?
Yep,
okay.
You can.
So we've had about 50 people complete the poll, and what you can see is that there seems to be more people. It's about 68% of people that are saying that they're their monitoring is kind of, you know, not effective, or somewhat kind of not effective. And we've got 32% of people saying that it's effective or somewhat effective. So yeah, it certainly does seem to kind of match the conversations that and the projects that we've been doing with operators over the last kind of 6 months. And yeah, there does seem to be a need there for, you know, filling some of those gaps, or collecting a bit more data, or a different type of data on fatigue in the new normal. So Christina has very nicely explained what that tool might look like. Hopefully you're seeing my screen, my shared PowerPoint again, the effective
I can.
title. Brilliant, thank you. So the Christine's explained the kind of post-trip questionnaire that could obviously be, you know, adapted to short haul situations, you know, pretty easily. But the idea of the kind of repeated like health check approach, I suppose, to fatigue really came from our experience with doing kind of mini LOSAs. So, you know, historically we've done or helped operators with a lot of kind of big LOSA projects that, you know, normally take 3 to 6 months, and they do every few years. But increasingly, you know, for example, we did help one airline that was conducting kind of a series of mini LOSAs to sample how well crew that had previously worked for another airline were integrating onto the line. So kind of repeated small checks of how well they were kind of moving over to the new SOP. So this kind of questionnaire approach is quite similar in the sense that we want to sample what you might call kind of, you know, normal, they're not that normal at the moment, but normal line ops regularly. And it's quite an inclusive approach, deliberately, quite kind of system-wide. So we're not looking for just you know, small numbers of reports. Obviously, reporting still needs to happen. You know, this isn't a this is complementary to the reports, but we're trying to kind of really engage more crew. And the you know, this questionnaire has been run, and we've been kind of really pleased actually with the response rate with it. And obviously there's quite a bit that you need to do to maintain a good response rate, because we want to be able to repeat the survey, you know, every few months, or however long, however frequently you deem necessary. In order for crew to engage and to participate, they're going to need some pretty decent feedback. And there's certainly an appetite from crew and from unions to have kind of feedback from the operation to kind of demonstrate that they've got a handle on fatigue risk management. It is a very dynamic response. So what we're doing is kind of, you might release the survey maybe for 2 weeks for crew to fill out, you know, every time they come back from a trip. And then it takes us another kind of 2 weeks to analyze and report back. So it's quite kind of quick, considering the amount of data and that we get, and the number of kind of relationships that we're able to pull out to kind of turn it around to manage the risk from 1 month to the next. Really critical to success is that this thing needs to be easy for crew. So yeah, online, short, 10 minutes. You know, we would love to write a survey that takes crew an hour to work to complete, but of course it's ridiculous. So it needs to be, yeah, quite simple, easy to do, and if you can de-identify the participants, that's only going to increase your response rate. It needs to be, yeah, it is, I should say, repeatable and adaptable. So the survey or the questionnaire is a kind of a combination of questions that are repeated every time it's released, and the idea of that is to enable us to do some, you know, ongoing monitoring of change. But then also the need to have some flexible questions, because as operations change, you know, as different types of, I don't know, exemption flights come and go, different destinations appear and disappear, we do need an ability to be able to adapt the question. So that, you know, certainly we can do that. And, you know, sometimes you might want to focus more on wellness, another month more on fatigue risk management, and that's all kind of possible within the structure. And finally, and this is the kind of little light bulb moment, I suppose, what we're doing in the questionnaire is kind of comprehensively evaluating operational sleep health. And so collecting all of the data that we need on things like, you know, your favorites, sleep, wakefulness, Karolinska, etc. But then to also collect both the operational and other variables that are needed to manage fatigue risk. So kind of historically, I suppose, we focused on the operational, and I think we've all learned the lesson personally over the last 6 months that we just can't underestimate the impact that the pandemic is having on our sleep health. So to kind of finish off, you know, fatigue risk management in the new normal, I think is going to be more comprehensive, or it needs to be more comprehensive. It has been a bit of a wake-up call for fatigue risk management, I think. You know, perhaps we didn't realise how kind of small-minded we were. Not small-minded, well, I'm including myself, I could say small-minded, but just not aware of the non-operational factors that are contributing to sleep and fatigue and well-being. So, you know, we focused on the operational solutions like better hotels or changing rosters. But of course, yeah, the sleep health crisis means that we do need to do better at measuring, and the questionnaire is one example of how we can do that, and supporting sleep health. And that kind of sleep health model is a kind of a nice model that we can use to do that. In the future, you know, we need to be integrating fatigue risk management with our wellbeing management. And obviously those are both supported by a just culture. And I think unless they're both integrated, you know, neither of them are going to be especially effective. So I'm going to let Christina talk us through this slide here, which explores some ideas for how we might be able to kind of practically go about improving mental health and well-being at work.
Yeah, I guess this slide, the main theme of this slide is that improving mental health and well-being takes a multi-layered approach. So we need to, it's something that the individual needs to do, but it takes also kind of an intervention at the interpersonal level, and systems needs to change. So there needs to be an intervention at the level of the organization. So what can we do as individuals? Well, I mean, how do we know whether we have, you know, good sleep health or good mental health? So one way in which we can do that is by monitoring well-being. And Cahill et al. And colleagues obviously looked at a tool for doing that, for assessing you know, mental health. And they acknowledged that you know, well-being is quite a holistic concept, and therefore there are so many things that can influence it, including sleep, diet, exercise, and this is kind of the biological variables. But then you've got the psychological variables. For example, you need to assess how stressed you feel, what your mood is like, but also what kind of resources do you have in place to help you cope with you know, with the stresses of everyday life. You know, do you have good social support at home and at work? So that's one area that we can improve on, you know, giving maybe crew a tool in order for them to kind of assess and monitor their well-being. But also it takes, you know, for people to change their kind of relationships with others. And invariably, or historically, we've put a lot of that kind of responsibility to leaders to, you know, be role models of, you know, good mental health and, you know, providing visibility and all of that. But I think because the pandemic is unprecedented, it needs to come down a level. I think we all need to be visible. We all need to look, you know, for potential problems in our colleagues, to listen to them and to link. And by link, we mean, you know, provide, you know, the resources. So just, you know, signpost them. It's a signposting, you know, kind of method. You can't obviously know everything. You can't provide the solutions to everything, but it's a good way of providing some support. So it's, you know, it's recognized that you can do something a little bit, it goes a long way. But also we need to normalize psychological responses. So actually it's okay not to be okay. And then it will be much easier for people to actually open up and to recognize that the new normal is a marathon, not a sprint. So we need to be kind to ourselves, to others, and we need to pace ourselves, and also acknowledge that we are all at different points of this cycle. So at the beginning of this pandemic, we might be psyching, ourselves up for the challenge, if you like, and then we're in the middle of it. We're more likely to go through maybe some stress, possibly go to the other side and maybe experience some, exhaustion or burnout. But then there's the recovery phase, and we need to acknowledge that actually we're all at different phases of this kind of psychological response, and so we need to kind of understand that that's going on. But systems need to change. We need to actually have better tools. We can't just expect the individuals to monitor their sleep health. We need, as organizations, we need to be better at actually, assessing sleep health, at assessing fatigue, not in terms of operational fatigue only, but also more in terms of, the physical kind of aspects of fatigue and the mental aspects of fatigue. So use more multidimensional measures of fatigue. And as with fatigue reporting, we need to have the right culture, like Alex was saying. We need to build a well-being culture. There is still stigma attached to talking about mental health, and somehow it's a little bit easier to talk about sleep. And we know from the literature and the strong link between sleep and mental health that if somebody is suffering heavily from sleep deprivation or sleep problems, they're very likely to then be impacted in their mental health later on. So it takes a kind of stepped approach. So if somebody is suffering, there are different levels. So we can start with maybe signposting them to some kind of support system, providing peer support, and then the ultimate level will be to provide psychological support. But we can't impose any of this because it's something that it needs to kind of be accepted by the individual for it to work. So it's not, it needs to be kind of individualized, if you like. And we'd like to finish on that, really, on that thought, because we need to be better at this. And we are providing some possible, ways in which we can do that. And in the same way, we can't have all the solutions, but it'd be interesting to kind of start this debate about how we get better at assessing and managing well-being at work. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand over back to Alex.
Thanks so much, Christina. So we've got a list now of the some of the resources. So if you do want to look for some support around what to do to improve fatigue risk management or well-being in your operation in the new normal, obviously these slides will all become available, and the links there are, I have to say, they're all really good materials there that you can access. What we wanted to do now was open up the discussion. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please do raise your hand and we can come to you, or you can pop a note in the questions box. We do have one question here that I can see from Mr. Dave Crompton, who is asking, I'd be interested on the data you've collected associated with fatigue in continued airworthiness and maintenance during COVID, as well as with airlines. So I think in response to that, Dave, unfortunately, we've not done any work in the last kind of 6 months with continued airworthiness or maintenance. And I think that probably what we've spoken about today is pretty applicable. I think fatigue risk management is a pretty kind of generic approach that we apply to all sorts of different industries, whether it's kind of aviation, HEMS through to big airlines, or to oil and gas or railways, or maintenance. And you know, it's all about context, isn't it? It's all about kind of adapting your methods to fit the context. So hopefully you've got something out of today, and it can be applied to continued airworthiness and maintenance. But yeah, and unfortunately we've not got too much experience in that field over the last 6 months to say much about. Perhaps you've got something that you would like to say about that particular field and how they're managing fatigue risk. Let me just see if I can go and see who's got their hand up, if anyone. Okay, let's see. No? Oh, no, there's a little person. Sorry, I'm just getting used to how this thing works. There we go. Michelle Miller. Here we go. I think, are you able to talk, Michelle? No, I think I've unmuted
I am,
you.
Alex. Can you
There
hear
we
me?
go. Hi.
Hi. Hi. I wanted to ask if you're suggesting that an organisation collect this data. So I'm thinking of not just an airline operator here, but perhaps a maintenance organisation or an air traffic control organisation.
Mm-hmm.
Typically what happens with these groups is that they collect all sorts of data and then they analyse it. But what would you expect them to do with this
Yes.
data? So you analyse it. What are you going to do with the sort of data that you've collected and analysed? What would you expect an organisation to act? How would you expect them to act on that data?
Very good question. So obviously, you know, once we've got the data, and you know, in a way, it's the easy bit. Once you've got the data, then we need to feed that into our risk management process. So we do need to, you know, a lot of airlines are recreating their fatigue risk or their hazard logs or their fatigue risk registers because everything's changed so much. So we need to be risk grading the outcomes. And then, you know, applying the appropriate controls going through our, you know, whether that's done through your fatigue safety action group or the safety action group, depending on kind of the hierarchy of the mitigations. But certainly after that, you know, there's a need to do the feedback to crew. You know, they're going to be looking for change in order for them to participate again when you want to do the survey in another 3 months, and for the union to, you know, to again endorse this as a data collection method, which you kind of really need. But in terms of the kind of actual mitigators that are in place, those would then be kind of documented in the risk management process so that you can kind of monitor their effectiveness onwards. And I think, you know, within this, one advantage of this method is that you do have the opportunity to adjust it. You know, part of it might stay the same and the other part of it might be adjusted. So you can use the questionnaire itself to monitor and mitigate it. So say you've augmented a flight, say you've provided a bit of extra rest, say you've, you know, whatever it is, you can then kind of track whether that's worked or not in the next questionnaire. So that's the kind of nice thing about it, is that it's quite kind of dynamic. Does that?
So Alex, how do you link the responses to specific operational conditions? Because my understanding was in this sort of questionnaire, it's widespread across the organisation. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So then how do you know what operational elements are affecting the responses that you're getting?
So that definitely comes down to the design of the questions in the first place. So if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to collect the right data. So there is a need, definitely to kind of workshop initially, you know, what are the hazards that we think that are out there, that we can ask questions about in the questionnaire. And then when we do the analysis, we look at kind of predetermined relationships between the data. And then depending on the results of that, you know, the process is kind of repeated the next time around. So it's kind of constantly evolving. But yeah, you definitely have to have some forethought about what, you know, if you don't ask crew about things like, I don't know, what's an example of a couple of things that we've added, Christina? Something on like sleep variability, for example.
Yeah, it's an important factor. Yeah.
You know, we're never going to be able to find the relationship between that and some of the other kind of, you know, KSS at top of descent. So you do have to kind of, yeah, carefully design the questionnaire.
Of course, the element of the operation need to be assessed as well, and that's why then you're linking it. You're linking the sleep with the schedules, but also you can have a look at, if that's what you want to do, the relationship between the actual sleep health variables or the others, you know, the sleep variability dimensions that we've added. So it's very much dependent on what you want to do. You need to refine it according to the aim of that particular project, because otherwise, yes, the scope is vast, but you need to be selective. Also, because you don't want to make the questionnaire too long. So yeah, you need to really write out what the questions are, and then go back and you know, adjust the design and the questions. But I think that the main point of this was that the sleep health model, it's a good way of focusing on what really matters, what matters about sleep. Because if we're looking at well-being as well, then, you know, the sleep quality is a good indicator that something may be going wrong. And if we're not assessing that, then we'll never know. And then later, if you're finding a particular problem with that, then later you can ask relevant questions about that. So it could be something that develops over time. You can't assess everything at the beginning. You can start with sleep health and then, you know, extend it on the basis of what you find.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Michelle.
Shall I read some of the questions?
Go for it.
Yes. Okay. So there is a question on, do you think we need to revisit the content and layout of fatigue reports in order to include more well-being rated questions?
It's a great question, isn't it? So
yeah.
At the moment, yeah, depending on the design of the form, sometimes it's quite kind of, you know, there's quite a big scope for kind of free text there for the crew to kind of describe what it is. And obviously, you know, that's going to come down to, you know, trust in the system and also the personality of the individual and various other kind of factors that will influence whether they're going to write in whether there's some personal situation is affecting their sleep health or not. And in other forms, it's much more like tick boxy, isn't it? Where you kind of tick perhaps long-term fatigue or something quite generic like home issues. So I think there probably is a scope to enhance that. But at the same time, I suppose, you know, it's always that battle, isn't it, between having a form that is long enough to get the data that you need and not too long to put people off. But I think there's probably, considering, you know, what we've learned over the last 6 months, it is a time to reflect perhaps on the design of those forms and to see whether they are collecting the best data, but also to create kind of a more formal link between the report and the wellness management system as well. So sometimes there's a bit of ambiguity about those links, and so to make that link clear, to explain it to crew, and then of course to sell it to them and explain that, you know, both are intended to be supportive. I think we've got some hands up, Christina.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry, I didn't.
No. So if I Claire Coombs.
Okay.
Hi, Claire.
Hi. I think I just typed the my question, but it was probably. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
And it was probably covered by one of the last questions. It was essentially around what level of fatigue risks in the data that you're collating sort of trigger action points at a management level. And I think, obviously, because we don't have an agreed perspective on how tired is too tired to be safely flying, that is causing a lot of difficulty across industry about how to appraise incoming data, because you can get into the spirit of collecting a lot of data but not actually knowing what warrants a sufficient safety risk to actually bring about quite serious changes. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that difficult situation.
Yeah, and of course, I think what's good about this data, I think, is that it kind of complements the reports, in a sense of, because the reports are, most of our reports that you would like to see are never submitted. Different airlines have done research to identify, what the underreporting rate is, and it's huge. So, in a sense, this is more of a kind of a health test of, line ops, day in the life, week in the life, 2 weeks in the life of an airline. So we're getting, hopefully, kind of a broad distribution of KSS at top of descent, more like a kind of a top of descent survey rather than the report. So you do get a better indication of kind of, where there are, let's say, high KSS ratings at top of descent, what proportion of the population doing that particular trip will give you those ratings. So is it 1 or 2, or is it 20%? And obviously we're going to need 2 different types of mitigators for those 2 things. I think sometimes, with reporting, the half the battle is the fact that we just don't know how representative it is. And with this, certainly what I'm saying is it's a kind of a step in the right direction in addressing that.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think also, just going back to the biomathematical modelling question, there's an interesting question if the rosters inputted into the model are predicting that you would expect a high level of fatigue risk associated with certain flights. If you're collecting report data that essentially confirms that, then it seems to me that the question moves onto a slightly different kind of moral and safety hazard question. Are we going to accept high levels of KSS at top of descent as an industry, or are we not?
Yeah, I think at the moment it's hard. Sometimes it can be hard to kind of make those decisions because there's doubt. People, operators will say, well, actually, we don't know if the model's right or not, or we don't know if those reports are just, kind of one-offs. So this is just one method in order to try and collect the data to kind of help with that. And yeah, ideally to kind of go back and feed into the model, because if your modeling tells you something completely different to what the questionnaire tells you, or what your top of descent tells you, then obviously there's a need to kind of go back and adjust that so that it's more accurate, to look at the kind of the assumptions that are made in the kind of sleep prediction.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I've got a few minutes left. Let's see if we've got any. If you've got any more hands raised, or if that is the end of today. Doesn't seem to be. Are there any more questions that you can see, Christina? I can't see any.
Sorry, you can't hear me.
Right.
There are similar questions. There was something from Irina about irregular schedules are likely to account for the lack of cumulative fatigue. So during the pandemic, maybe, I'm not quite sure whether that's related to this new normal and the fact that crew are not flying as much, I guess, and therefore you're not seeing that pattern of cumulative fatigue that builds up normally when crew are flying every week. But I guess that would be different from now on, because depending on, obviously where you are in the world, but thinking of the UK as people are coming back from furlough, there will be more crew maybe, so less work potentially. So yes, there could be a perhaps a reduction in cumulative fatigue, but because there is this increase in potential stresses, so fatigue could be perceived to be more kind of linked to their well-being then. So it doesn't matter where it comes from, really. In a way, it will have an impact on your performance, and that's what we're saying, that we need, you know, often we try to kind of operationalize things, so we divide, you know, well-being and fatigue and other variables, but they're actually all linked together. So perhaps now the fatigue comes from more kind of the lack of well-being that people are experiencing, and so we're saying that it's important that we need to know more about this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have had a bit of a reset, haven't they, in terms of their fatigue. I mean, when we're not suffering from anxiety, I know personally I'm been getting more sleep than I think I've ever got, and the same is true for a lot of crew. So it's that variability, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And whilst, as you said, Alex, most people are probably getting more sleep, it's not necessarily refreshing, and that's the well-being part.
Yeah,
that affects people. It's not just about the quantity, but the quality, and therefore, you know, looking at sleep health as a whole, kind of more holistic perspective, gives you a better picture of sleep, but also potentially mental health. That's really what we're saying, that we need to be better at looking at more kind of a complete picture, rather than focusing on just one or two variables. But I understand that because of the operation and the scope, you know, you'd want to be more selective. But I think this is probably the time that we need to be more open to, you know, having tools that actually assess well-being, because it really matters now.
What a wonderful point to finish on, Christina.
Okay, all right.
We're 1 minute over our time.
Okay.
And yeah, I just think you concluded today really well. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that has joined us today for the session. If you've got any questions after the session, please feel free to get in touch with us, and we'll definitely make today available so that you can access this later, or if you want to send a link to anyone that you might think could be interested. But I think we'll say goodbye now, and perhaps see you next time. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Alex, and everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.